How excited are you today whenever you watch the latest sci-fi movie about Star Wars? Nowadays, we can enjoy movies or books all the time about enthralling battles in space between massive armies of monstrous creatures. But how are these connected to the ancient world? And what's more, how did a Greek-speaking Syrian of the 2nd century AD shape the way we imagine aliens and kingdoms in space today? Lucian of Samosata was born in Syria around the year 125 AD, in the time of the Roman Empire. He was famed as a satirist, and used his writing to ridicule the society and religious superstitions of his own era. In his most famous work, called A True Story, Lucian parodies earlier classic writers for their fake and fanciful tales, and neither the inspired poet Homer nor the meticulous military historian Thucydides could escape his mockery. A True Story is the first work of science fiction literature that tells of a star war, a dispute between the inhabitants of the moon and those of the sun, fought over a colony on the planet Venus. Lucian relates the story in his own voice, and begins with a voyage on the high seas beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the western limits of the known world. As he and his comrades were sailing in their ship, out of nowhere a violent hurricane suddenly arose and spun the boat around, lifting it from the sea up and up into the air. For 7 days and 7 nights they traveled through the sky, until a great spherical land, like an island, appeared in front of them, a bizarre sight that was shining on the horizon. It was the moon. When they dropped anchor and came down in this land, they discovered it was inhabited and cultivated. During daylight, there was nothing they could see in the sky, but when night fell, they marveled at the view of other celestial bodies, and one of them, most of all, a world with cities, rivers, seas, and forests, the Earth. The adventurers decided to advance further inland, but they came face to face with extraordinary creatures, enormous vultures with 3 heads and wings longer and thicker than the main mast of a cargo ship. Men rode these gigantic birds, so they called them horse vultures, and flew on them around the land, arresting any strangers they discovered and leading them to their king, named Endymion. So they found and seized Lucian and his brave comrades, and when they arrived at the Moon King's court, Endymion inspected them and recognized by their clothes that they were Greeks. He interrogated them about how they had arrived in his kingdom, while revealing more about himself as well, that he too was Greek, and began his life on Earth before falling asleep one night and being mysteriously transported here to the moon. Endymion proved a friend and ally, providing everything Lucian and his comrades might need. And then the king mentioned that if he were to return victorious from the war he was waging against the people of the sun, their life there would be a paradise. Upon hearing this, the curious Lucian couldn't resist asking more about this war. Endymion's enemy was Phaethon, the king of the nations of the sun, who had waged war on the moon's inhabitants for an age. And the reason for their rivalry was a colony on Venus. The Moon King wanted to gather together the poorest of his kingdom and send them off to begin a new life on Venus in a colony they would found, since Venus had no inhabitants yet. King Phaethon became jealous and prevented the passage of the settlement by meeting the ships midway with troops mounted on ants the size of horses. The people of the moon were defeated that day because they had no resources to fight, and they fled in retreat. but nevertheless they prepared to wage war against Phaethon again and transport a colony there. The king invited the newly arrived traveler Lucian to participate in his campaign, promising him a horse vulture from the royal stables and all the necessary equipment for war. That was more than enough for the adventurous Lucian to hear. At dawn, the two sides met and formed battle formations, and the king's scouts were beginning to signal the enemy's approach. The total number of King Endymion's army of the moon came to 100,000 troops, not counting the baggage carriers, the engineers, the foot soldiers, and the allies. And of those allies, 80,000 rode on horse vultures, and 20,000 were mounted on cabbage wings, giant birds without real wings, but cabbage sprouts growing all over their bodies, with quills just like leaves of lettuce. Next to them were the millet slingers and the garlic brigade. In addition, 30,000 flea archers and 50,000 air runners, who were allies from the constellation of the Bear, had come to assist King Endymion. And of these, the flea archers were mounted upon great fleas, the size of 12 elephants. And the air runners were foot soldiers who flew through the air without wings as light-armed troops. They wore tunics that hung down to their feet, and by flapping these in the wind like sails, they were borne up like ships. And alongside them were 70,000 ostrich acorners and 50,000 horse cranes, who arrived from the constellations over Cappadocia. But Lucian only heard about these, and never saw them with his own eyes. In the army of Endymion, their helmets were made of beans, the large, hard beans that grow on the moon. Their breastplates were of lupine blades, stitched together and covered with scales, because on the moon, the blade of lupine is unbreakable. And their shields and swords were made in the style of the Greeks. When the king of the moon gave his command, they fell into formation in this order. The horse vultures took the right wing where stood the king himself, accompanied by his nobles, including Lucian and his friends. The cabbage wings took the left, and the allies chose their positions at the center. The foot soldiers, about 6 million in total, followed the formation. And on the moon, there are giant spiders, each far bigger than any island of Greece. They were commanded to weave a web in space between the moon and Venus, and accomplished this task quickly, making a plain for the king to position his infantry. Among the enemy's forces, some 50,000 horse ants occupied the left wing with the Sun King Phaethon. These massive winged beasts look like ants on Earth, except for their huge size, which can reach a length of 200 feet. They carried warriors as their riders, and were also warriors themselves as they fought with their antennae. On the right wing mustered the air mosquitoes, also 50,000 strong, with archers on their backs. In their rear followed the air trotters, who had no armor and came on foot, but they too took part in the battle. They fitted outsized radishes in their deadly slings, and whomever they struck could not survive for long, but died slowly from the awful stench that arose from the wound. It was said that they daubed their missiles with mallow juice. And behind these advanced 10,000 heavily armed troops to fight at close quarters, the terrifying mushroom stalkers with their mushroom shields and spears made from shafts of asparagus. The dog nutters were positioned next to them, dispatched by the people of the dog star Sirius, warriors with the faces of dogs, who fought atop winged acorns, and they numbered 5,000 strong. Fortunately, some allies of the sun would arrive too late to help Phaethon in this battle. and the slingers Phaethon had summoned from the Milky Way never came at all. Once the banners had been unfurled and the donkeys on each side had brayed, since their tradition was to use donkeys instead of trumpets for battle signals, the war among the stars began. The left wing of the sun's forces turned tail at once, refusing to join combat with the moon's horse vultures, so Endymion's side pursued them and laid waste to their army. But on the right wing, the sun began to prevail over the moon. The air mosquitoes chased them and advanced right up to the lines of the infantry. But with the aid of the soldiers on foot, they broke rank and fled, especially when they saw that the troops on their left wing had been defeated. After that brilliant victory, countless troops were taken captive or killed. So many streams of blood poured down from that celestial battlefield upon the clouds that they turned red, just as clouds grow red when the sun is setting on the earth. When the forces of the moon broke off their pursuit of the enemy, they put up 2 trophies of their victory, one for the infantry battle fought on the spider's woven web, and another for the air war fought upon the clouds. Meanwhile, the scouts announced that another force loyal to the sun was now arriving, though too late for the battle that had just been decided. These were the gargantuan cloud centaurs, a combination of a human and a winged horse. The human part from the middle up was the height of the Colossus of Rhodes, and the horse parts were the size of a transport ship. Their commander was the archer of the zodiac, Sagittarius, and they were so numerous that their presence could have changed the outcome of the whole battle. Once they saw that they were too late, and their allies had already been defeated, they sent a message to Phaethon asking him to renew his attack on the forces of the moon. And so the cloud centaurs drew up in formation and fell upon Endymion's armies, which had broken rank and scattered in disorder to pursue the enemy and find spoils for themselves. This new onslaught drove them into retreat, as they chased Endymion himself back to his city and slew most of his birds. They demolished his 2 trophies and overran the entire plain the spiders had woven, and they captured Lucian and 2 of his earthborn companions. Now it was the enemies who were setting up their trophies, and that same day Lucian and his comrades were taken to the sun, tied by strands of a spider's web. The sun's armies decided against besieging Endymion's city, so turned back and built a wall between the sun and the moon to prevent the rays of light from the sun from ever reaching the moon again. The wall was a double circuit around the great star, constructed of clouds, and the moon was plunged into eclipse and soon overwhelmed by the deepest black of night. Oppressed by this wall and this darkness, King Endymion sent a delegation to entreat Phaethon to demolish it and not make them suffer in utter blackness. He promised to pay tribute from the moon, to hand over hostages, and enter into an alliance with the sun, and never again wage war against Phaethon. Phaethon and the people of the sun held 2 assemblies, but could not assuage their own anger on the first day. But on the following day, when cooler heads prevailed, they changed their minds, and the peace treaty was accepted. The conditions of the treaty were as follows. The sun would demolish the wall, and would never again attack the moon. Each side would return its prisoners for an agreed sum of ransom. The people of the moon would leave the other stars autonomous and never again bear arms against the people of the sun. And in case of an attack from the outside, each nation would come to the aid of the other. the King of the Moon would pay as an annual tribute to the King of the Sun 10,000 amphoras filled with fresh dew, and he would pledge 10,000 of his people to colonize Venus, the morning star, in a joint enterprise between colonists from the Moon and the Sun. This treaty was to be publicly inscribed in a stele of amber at the shared border between the Sun and the Moon, the thin air between the two heavenly bodies. Representatives of the Sun and the Moon together swore an oath to uphold the peace between their peoples. And so the wall between Sun and Moon was immediately destroyed, and the Sun returned all those they had taken as prisoner, including Lucian and his friends. When the Earth folk returned to the Moon, Endymion and the rest of their companions welcomed them back with a tearful embrace. The king implored them to remain on the Moon and to take part in the expedition to found a city on Venus, and even promised Lucian marriage with a noble bride. But Lucian instead asked the kind king to let them return to the sea below. When Endymion realized he couldn't win them over, he feasted grandly with them for 7 days, and then sent them on their way. And with this farewell to the kingdom of the Moon, Lucian completed his otherworldly journey to the stars and returned to Earth. And the rest of his true story would unfold from there. So the next time you grab your popcorn and enjoy a modern sci-fi story, remember that stories of wars among the stars reach far back into the ancient past, to the imagination of Lucian of Samosata, and the true story he brought back to us from the far horizons of outer space.